Hello, and welcome back to High Score. In this series of videos, I'm taking a closer look at how music and sound is used in video games and what impact it has on the player's experience of the game. In the first half of the series, we looked at world building, motifs and themes, the history of video game music, and how Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild use music in their soundtracks. I have an action-packed second half of the series lined up, including sound effects, mobile games and remixes. First, however, it's the turn of indie puzzle platformer Celeste to take the musical spotlight. This game has one of the best soundtracks of any game I've ever played, and I'll be using this video to try and explain why I think that. It does, however, come with some content warnings. Due to the nature of Celeste's story and how its music is intertwined with its themes, this video will touch on the topics of anxiety, grief and depression. These won't be discussed in detail, and I'll place specific warnings ahead of the relevant sections, but if you're not comfortable with these areas, you're more than welcome to skip over them. Why this game? While researching in 6th Gear for my dissertation, I was also playing through Celeste for the first time, so it was convenient for me to pick it as a case study for my essay. Unfortunately, it just didn't hold enough comparisons to Breath of the Wild, and so I dropped it in favour of Ocarina of Time. Not before I spent 2 days writing out my research though. The first words I typed for my dissertation were on Celeste, and over 48 hours I wrote just under 4,000 words, which were all cut shortly after. Celeste was released in January 2018, and has gone on to win multiple awards for its gameplay, story, and soundtrack, written primarily by American composer Lena Raine. The game is a puzzle platformer. The player must first work out how they progress through each screen before going on to execute this solution. Players will die often, but are encouraged to try and try again, an idea which ties into the game's theme of determination. The gameplay is tight. Polygon's Russ Frushtick says of the player's responsibility, "As you glide through the air, narrowly avoiding spikes or lava flows, you'll feel in complete control of the situation. Therefore, if you die, it's on you." The game's story has also been praised for the way in which it presents and confronts the issues surrounding mental health. Through various characters, the ideas of anxiety, depression, and grief are highlighted, and even discussed during cutscenes. This is done in such a way that the player can often relate to what the characters are experiencing. In his review for GameSpot, Oscar Deus sums it up perfectly. He says, "Seeing her suffer is difficult to handle, and it's impossible to watch it happen without thinking of your own problems. But that, plus the brilliant merging of gameplay and narrative, is what makes Celeste so emotionally powerful." A large part of this emotional impact is channeled through the game's soundtrack. It consists of 34 tracks, including the additional level Farewell. Each of the game's 9 levels has one or more track tied to it, which highlights the current narrative or theme. Unfortunately, there's no way I could dissect each and every one of these tracks and give them all the attention they deserve. I'd be here all week. Instead, this video will consider characters, the game's overarching themes, the remixes found in certain levels, and will end with a breakdown of 2 of the game's most impressive tracks, Reach for the Summit and Farewell. Reflections in the Mirror. Celeste assigns loose melodies or instruments to characters in order to help players identify them. The prime example of this is Madeline, the game's protagonist. The player controls her, guiding her through each level and learning about her struggles with anxiety and panic attacks in cutscenes. Many of the tracks throughout the game contain a particular motif which is associated with Madeline. You can hear it in the opening levels track, First Steps. The theme appears often throughout the game, and we as players learn to associate it with Madeline, her character, personality, and constant struggle against the mountain. At no point does the game, or indeed the soundtrack, explicitly state that this is Madeline's theme, and yet it's easy to connect the two. In the game's second level, the Old Site, the player encounters Part of Me. Sometimes referred to as Badeline, Part of Me appears as a darker, purple-blue version of Madeline's sprite. She describes herself as a manifestation of Madeline's anxiety and insecurity, and appears in every level in the game after this point, taunting and jeering at Madeline, trying to convince her to give up and go home. This culminates in the game's only boss fight at the end of Chapter 6, Reflection. Following this confrontation, she and Madeline accept each other and work together to take on the final level. This, in some ways, represents Madeline accepting and overcoming her anxieties. Unlike Madeline, Part of Me has no specific theme. Instead, the game uses synths to represent the character. While Madeline's theme usually appears on piano, whenever Part of Me appears, a synth line can be heard, either on top of existing music or replacing it with a completely new track. Listen to the soundtrack for the Old Site level, Resurrections, at the point where Madeline first hears her counterpart speak. Notice how only the piano and synth tracks are present, but the synth has a melody, not piano. This association isn't as obvious as Madeline's theme, but there are 2 points throughout the game where Part of Me's musical presence is particularly noticeable. I'll talk more in depth about these in the next section. Also notable is the soundtrack for the previously mentioned boss fight. The track, titled Confronting Myself, combines Madeline's theme with heavy synths and a vocal track, and modulates partway through, becoming even more hectic and chaotic. This reflects the platforming and narrative the player is experiencing alongside it. At the end of each screen, the music distorts briefly as Part of Me flees, solidifying that this track is tied firmly to her, not Madeline. Following this battle, a cutscene plays in which Madeline and Part of Me embrace. This scene uses the same melody as heard in Part of Me's first appearance, this time played solely on piano. This simplicity allows the player to appreciate its existence without taking away from the important scene unfolding. A similar scene unfolds during the final section of Farewell. The scene features the characters discussing Madeline's grief over her mentor's death, and how Madeline continuing through this level is only causing more hurt. The two characters have had conflict throughout this chapter, and it's during this cutscene that they once again put their differences aside to overcome a greater challenge, a narrative which bears striking resemblance to the previous cutscene. Solidifying this connection, the track which plays here, Reconciliation, features the Farewell theme on piano with no synth line. This, once again, allows the player to focus entirely on the emotional dialogue without distraction. As Madeline climbs the mountain, she often encounters the Old Woman. The Old Woman is initially sceptical of Madeline's ability to climb the mountain, while, rather humorously, she herself seems to get around the mountain with relative ease. Madeline ignores her, however after defeating and reconciling with Part of Me, the Old Woman praises her determination and encourages her to face the final climb. The two characters are shown to have become close after the events of the main story, with Madeline now referring to her as Granny. Unfortunately, things aren't quite as rosy in Farewell. The level opens by revealing that Granny has died and that Madeline was too anxious to attend her funeral. In fact, the level's entire narrative revolves around Madeline coming to terms with loss by interacting with a blue bird, which she believes to be Granny's equivalent of Part of Me. On the positive side, it does give us another theme to consider, the Farewell theme, heard here in the level's first gameplay track, Fear of the Unknown. In the majority of cases, this theme is played on the violin, an instrument which doesn't appear in any other part of the soundtrack. In the same way synths represent part of me, we can assume violin is a representation of Granny. Finally, we have Theo. Theo is an aspiring photographer who Madeline meets on her journey up the mountain. Obsessed with his followers on Instapics, he listens to Madeline's thoughts and feelings at several points throughout the game. During these cutscenes, the track Madeline and Theo plays. In his first appearance, the track actually interrupts the levels track, the only time this occurs within the game. The track itself is relaxing and features a guitar melody which accompanies Madeline's piano theme. The final track in Farewell, Vovo e Vovo, also features a guitar, so we can safely assume that the instrument represents Theo. The cutscenes in which Theo appears are calm and reflective, allowing Madeline to consider her mental state and motivations. As you can hear in this cutscene at the end of Chapter 4, the music mirrors this for most of these cutscenes. Anxiety. The end of chapter jingle begins, but loops in a sinister manner, and part of me appears, causing the gondola to crash to a halt. The chapter complete jingle is gradually drowned out by synths, and most of the visuals fade to black, leaving only Madeline on screen. This scene represents Madeline having a panic attack. The music is used here to mimic the attack itself. The jingle might usually signal success and achievement, but here it doesn't quite sound right and never completes, looping endlessly. Over this, synths begin drowning the piano out, creeping in over something positive just as anxiety so often does. At this point, the player is overwhelmed both visually and musically, mirroring how overwhelming this attack is to Madeline. The heavy synths suffocate the player as they try to escape. Theo teaches Madeline a technique to overcome her attack, and a small minigame begins, where the player must keep a golden feather within a box on screen, timed to Madeline's breathing. While doing this, the synths begin to fade, and the original piano melody returns, representing Madeline overcoming her attack. At the beginning of Chapter 6, Madeline and Theo have a long discussion about their mental health, and Theo encourages her to accept part of me as part of who she is. As with the previous cutscene, the track Madeline and Theo plays throughout. However, once the cutscene ends, the track continues, the high synth line beginning to develop and alter as Madeline encounters part of me, and the characters discuss their relationship. Part of me retaliates, instigating another panic attack, and this synth line begins to distort, becoming much heavier and more recognisable as part of me's theme. The bass line also becomes much heavier, and percussion is added as Madeline is dragged to the bottom of the mountain. These cutscenes aren't pretty, and neither are their soundtracks. They are harsh, distorted, and difficult to listen to, for me at least. In exactly the same way Ocarina of Time uses music to reward and congratulate the player, Celeste uses these tracks to overwhelm them. They mimic and mirror the real effects of anxiety and panic attacks by creeping in, then suddenly taking hold, crushing Madeline beneath hard bass lines and dark visuals. It's not pretty, but it is effective. On their own, these tracks create a sense of fear and panic, but remember that players will first experience them in the context of the game. That context? Both of these cutscenes follow extended periods with Theo. Both follow large sections of text where Madeline seems to come to terms with herself and her anxiety. And crucially, both follow immediately after the Madeline and Theo track. This track is perhaps the safest track in the game. Sure, most of the level themes aren't exactly scary, but the moments Madeline and Theo spend together are indeterminate in length. There's no urgency, no challenge, no burden on the player to perform. They can just relax. So not only is the player being subjected to the harsh synth lines of anxiety and star jump, but they're also being dragged there from a place of calm and safety. The tracks pull the player from one extreme to the other, 0 to 10 in a few seconds. This highlights the contrast between these pieces and makes the experience all the more uncomfortable. Take a listen to the track Final Defiance from Farewell. This track plays during the second to last section of the level, and it's used to help the player time their jumps between blocks, which move to the speed of the music. The section itself comes after Madeline has pushed past multiple warnings from part of me, following the bluebird she believes to be the old ruin deeper into this mysterious world. The track is pretty empty, desolate and void of any melody or feeling. This matches Madeline's state of mind at this point, which is shown clearly in the following cutscene. The track which transitions into this cutscene is called Futility. Madeline has lost all hope of finding the old ruin and escaping with her. She's reached rock bottom. When she catches the bird, she says, This is a particularly poignant moment, and the music is intrinsically a part of it. It doesn't accompany, or guide, or aid. It is Madeline, and by extension, the player. Ultimately, Madeline overcomes her grief and depression, but the music throughout the entirety of this chapter highlights exactly how low she sinks during parts of it. Good Karma. Hidden in each level is a B-side, collectibles which, predictably, look like cassette tapes. You do still know what a cassette tape is, right? On collecting these, the player unlocks a B-side level. These are more difficult levels, created using extended gameplay techniques found in the levels they're linked to. For example, the old site's B-side level introduces a boost jump mechanic using the space blocks found in the original level. To be clear, these mechanics aren't new. They can be executed at any time in any level, but the B-sides are often the first instance of the player coming across them. To match these newly designed levels, the game uses remixed versions of the original tracks. These are composed by a variety of artists, including Kurain, the pen name of original composer Lena Raine. Inviting other artists to partake in the composition of the game's soundtrack gives it a much more community-driven feeling. Indeed, the game itself has a large community following and features multiple fan-made levels and mods to the original game. It also increases the variety of the soundtrack, with each composer bringing their own unique style to the table. For example, listen again to the Chapter 6 track, Confronting Myself. Now listen to that level's B-side track, titled Reflection, Centre of the Earth Mix, written by Jukio Kallio. Notice the similarities? As a side note, Kallio is also partly responsible for the Fall Guys soundtrack. Saying farewell is never easy. The game's final levels, Summit and Farewell, both use a similar method of empowering and encouraging the player through their music. I'm approaching this section a little differently by giving a real-time musical analysis of each track. Following Madeline and part of me's conflict, they advance on to the final level of the game, the Summit. This level sees the player climb the entire mountain in one go, and gameplay mechanics from each of the previous levels appear in short bursts. Listen to the opening of the track. Recognise it? It's taken from the opening of the very first level, but this time with a proper conclusion and added synth lines. This shows the player just how far they've come since that first level, and also indicates the presence of part of me. The player is no longer alone. The level's first segment represents Chapter 6, Reflection, and features Madeline's theme on piano, with some strings and synth tracks providing the accompaniment. While chronologically this wasn't the first level the player experienced, Madeline was dragged to the very bottom of the mountain in the previous chapter, and must climb back through this area first before reaching any other. Following this, Madeline and part of me ascend to the Forsaken City and Old Site segments. These feature a livelier bassline and an additional synth playing the melody. These additions to the melody and accompaniment really drive home the presence of part of me. Between each segment, the pair discuss their adventure and begin accepting each other's help on the climb. Celestial Resort follows and features a theremin playing part of the accompaniment and melody line. Two synth lines share and swap the melody throughout, while the piano recedes to the background. Now we move on to the Golden Ridge part of the level. Until this point, the piece featured a lively string part, encouraging and cheering the player onwards. Here, This string part falls away and is replaced by a deep bass synth line. This major change in instrumentation gives the piece a much more peaceful presence, reflecting the delicate nature of this part of the mountain. Continuing with this idea, the mirror temple section removes almost all movement within the piece, leaving only the piano playing very softly in the background and the synth line playing only chords. This is the final section to relate to a previous area within the game, and features only piano and synth, the instruments representing Madeline and part of me. Having overcome their differences, the characters can now accept each other and conquer the mountain. The section ends with the music fading to nothing, before coming crashing back in as the player begins their final climb to the mountain summit. This final section brings back every instrument for an energetic repeat of the first, now with piano and synth lines sharing the melody. This represents Madeline and part of me's reliance on each other. final screens of Farewell use a track by the same name. Rather than having segmented screens using previous mechanics independently of each other, this final section simply features all gameplay mechanics used in conjunction across several screens. These are generally considered as some of the hardest challenges the game has to offer. The track is centred around this A pedal quaver and the key of A minor. As the pedal continues through the whole piece, and given previous associations, it's safe to say it represents Madeline. The first section features this pedal, percussion, and a vocal line, as well as a stretched out Madeline's theme in the bass. No other level in Farewell has featured vocals, and the only other appearance of them is in Confronting Myself, when Madeline and Part of Me battle. In addition, this is the first appearance of Part of Me in Farewell gameplay, so it's safe to assume these vocals represent her. Into the second section, the bass line becomes livelier. A new synth line also appears, not dissimilar to that featured in Golden Ridge's Wind sections. A theremin line is also added, taking the place of the bass line playing Madeline's theme. In the third section, the percussion line drops away entirely. This leaves only the piano chords and pedal A, which is now changed to a minim, and the synth chords. This drops the urgency of the piece, changing the overall tone to a much more sombre mood. This is emphasised when the violin enters, playing the chapter's theme. We've already discussed how this instrument likely represents either the chapter or Granny. This appearance furthers that idea. From here, the player advances to the final screen. This is by far the longest and most challenging screen they will face, incorporating elements from every other level in the game. The music reflects this, fading out before building to a climax with synth and percussion bursting into the farewell theme. Everything the player has experienced, learned, and heard throughout their adventure comes down to this final challenge. Madeline's theme and the farewell theme connect, playing on synth, piano and violin, while part of me's vocal line continues to sound underneath. Of course, every track, no matter how final, must loop at some point. For Farewell, this point is now. Much of the track's bluster begins to fade out as the player approaches the end of the level. The percussion and synth lines drop out, leaving only part of me's vocals and Madeline's pedal A. Finally, even the vocals disappear, leaving the player and Madeline exactly where they started, a pedal A and very much alone. No more running. There's something special about this game that I've not quite been able to put my finger on. In some ways, the soundtrack doesn't fit into any of the categories I've talked about so far in this series. It doesn't really use music to build its worlds. It doesn't use sound effects extensively, at least no more than any other game. And it doesn't have that many cutscenes which wrestle control away from the player. Instead, the game's soundtrack buries itself deep within the player's emotions, just like its narrative. The music doesn't accompany Madeline, it is Madeline. It is part of me and Theo and Granny. It represents each level, each twist, each new screen, every new mechanic you learn. Every time you die, it's there to pick you back up again, brush you down and push you onwards. Every time you clear a screen after hours of trying, it's there to congratulate you. The game and the soundtrack exist as one entity, combined into one experience. Each character is represented in the soundtrack, whether it be an explicit musical theme or through instrumentation. We learn to identify these characters through these themes, even if we don't notice it happening. The game also makes use of heavy synth tracks and distortion to simulate anxiety and panic attacks. These are major factors in the game's story, and are made even more effective by the huge contrast to the scenes directly preceding them. The music imitates the onset of panic attacks, but leaves room for the player and Madeline to grapple with their mental health when the narrative requires it. The final levels, Summit and Farewell, make use of a medley of previous gameplay mechanics to test the player. The music reflects this, using compositional techniques and instrumentation from these past levels to remind the player of each step of their journey. Reach for the Summit tackles each level individually, while Farewell bundles everything into one big challenge, testing the player to their absolute limit while throwing every musical concept from the game into one massive dynamic track. Why does Celeste feel so special to so many people? Well, like with any subjective medium, it's impossible to say for sure, but the ideas I've touched on in this video might hold some clues. The game deals with anxiety, depression, and grief in a delicate but effective way. It covers such a huge range of themes, so the vast majority of people playing the game will be able to relate, on some level at least, to what Madeline is going through. So many people suffer from anxiety, depression, or other mental health issues, and they'll connect to Madeline in a way which they just wouldn't with other avatars. Whether this be a wow, I've been in almost exactly this situation, or just a wow, I've never linked that feeling to anxiety before. These are experiences that just won't appear in other titles. Seeing as the music plays such a big role in creating and developing these themes, it stands to reason that it will also resonate with players in this way. Regardless of personal experience, it's clear that Celeste touched a lot of people, myself included. I could talk about each track and level for hours, but I'll be kind and try and keep this video relatively short. If you want to know more about the game, there are hundreds of analysis videos and articles out there. That's how popular it is. You can also play it on just about every platform these days, so I'd highly recommend it if you haven't already. Thank you for watching this video, and congratulations on making it all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed it and perhaps learned something along the way. I've really loved making every part of this video. Everything about this game makes me happy, or sad, but in a happy way. Here are my references, as well as a music list, and all of the ways you can contact me with any questions. We're on to the back 6 of the series now, and next week's topic is the use of sound effects in relation to both the player and the world. With that, thank you for watching, and I'll be back next week.